Tonight we continue in our study in the book of John, and tonight we're going to look at the first 21 verses of John chapter 6. So if you have your Bibles in front of you, I recommend turning there. For our introduction, we will just read the first 21 verses. Excuse me. So John chapter 6, starting in verse 1, says, "After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias. Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples. Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near. Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread, that these may eat?' But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, 'There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?' Then Jesus said, 'Make the people sit down.' Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, 'Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost.' Therefore they gathered them up, and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten. Then those men, when they had seen the sign that Jesus did, said, 'This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world.' Verse 15, "Therefore when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. Now when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea toward Capernaum. And it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. And the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. But he said to them, 'It is I, do not be afraid.' Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going." So tonight we'll look at these two sections, feeding the 5,000 and Jesus walking on the sea. So if you have your Bibles, I recommend just opening up to John 6, as we'll be spending the majority of our time there. Get down verse by verse. We're just going to go from verse 1 and see what we can learn from these two things. So starting right in verse number 1, again it says, "After these things, Jesus went over the Sea of Galilee, which is the Sea of Tiberias." And so in order to really grasp and understand the timeline here and understand the context, we need to first go back to Matthew 14, because it shows us more of the context there. In the first 12 verses of Matthew 14, we find John the Baptist is beheaded by King Herod. The disciples then bury his body, and then they went and told Jesus about John's death. And so then, because of this, Jesus decides he wants to be alone. And he gets on a boat, and he crosses the Sea of Galilee. Now, John doesn't make mention of this in his account, but we learn from Matthew that Jesus does this after hearing about John's death. Now, the other thing that confused me at first was the Sea of Tiberias. What is that? Why is that even in there? And it's simply just a note that it was later known as a different name. It's not saying that they're two different things. They are the same thing. It has this other name because the city of Tiberias was founded on the western shore in honor of the second Roman emperor Tiberius. And so it's named after that Roman emperor. Over time, that sea has had many names, and they're usually depending on the dominant settlement on its shores. So at one point it was Galilee, at one point it was Tiberias, and there's multiple other names that is known for. Verse 2 says, "Then a great multitude followed him, because they saw his signs which he performed on those who were diseased. And Jesus went up on the mountain, and there he sat with his disciples." So we see originally that Jesus went to be alone. But as soon as the people got word of his whereabouts, they flocked straight to him. Now, around this time, we can kind of think of Jesus as a celebrity in a sense. He was much more popular than what we've read about in the past with just the occasional gathering. At this point, I can imagine he has a hard time finding time to be alone because of his status. Some were probably there simply out of curiosity of who he was because they've heard his name and heard about who he was and what he's done. Others were there to be taught. Maybe they've been following him for a while. And others, of course, were there simply because they were diseased of some kind. They had their own issue to deal with. They were hoping Jesus would heal them. Or maybe they were bringing their loved ones or their friends with them to be healed by Jesus. Now, when we read that Jesus went up on the mountain, in the Greek, it really means the mountainous part. So for us reading, he went up to the mountain, it kind of seems like he went on the peak of a mountaintop. But I don't think that's what that means. I think it just means a higher elevation above where the crowd would have been. They were in kind of a plain area, so it's probably more of a flat area. And so it wouldn't have been as suitable to address all those people and for the other events as well that were to occur later on in this story. So they found the higher ground, and then Jesus there sat down with his disciples to then teach the crowd. And this trip across the sea, it began as an opportunity to rest, but now has become another great chance for conversation and prayer and teaching and healing and showing them who he really was. And the presence of the multitudes gave occasion for another significant event, which we'll read about, and that's the feeding of the 5,000. Verse 4 says, "Now the Passover, a feast of the Jews, was near." So verse 4, even as small and as almost random as it seems, it's very important to understand the timeline here. So as we know, the Passover was an annual feast, and many gathered in Jerusalem for this event. And when we compare this here to the previous chapter, we can see that those events were also leading up to the Passover. So we can kind of get this timeline in our heads, assuming this is about a year later, which I think it kind of helps us understand why Jesus struggles so much to be alone, because it's been a whole year of healing and spreading his good news and showing the people who he was, and so that status has increased. It's been a whole year of that. So it makes sense to see the amount of growth that he's received. This also explains to us why there's so many people, especially so many Jews in one area at one time. This area, as you can probably imagine, isn't, it's not a big lavish city. It's the plains by the Sea of Galilee. So it makes sense that these people were here because they were probably on their way to Jerusalem for the feast as well. Verse 5, "Then Jesus lifted up his eyes, and seeing a great multitude coming toward him, he said to Philip, 'Where shall we buy bread, that these may eat?' But this he said to test him, for he himself knew what he would do." So you can imagine looking out and seeing all of these people, and the first thing that comes to mind is, well, how are we going to take care of them? Where's the food going to come from, since there's probably not much near them? Maybe a couple small villages or towns here and there, but not enough to feed 5,000 plus people. All that they probably had is what they brought with them. And you can imagine it could even have been later in the day, and so they might have already eaten a lot of the food that they might have brung. So that brings up that cause for concern even more. And so this problem was presented to Philip, not because Jesus couldn't solve it and needed to help, but to test him, to see if he would exhibit true faith in Jesus to resolve the matter. Now, it's important to note that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a different account of how this conversation happened, but they don't contradict with John's. In their accounts, we find that the disciples first come to Jesus with the issue. Matthew 14, verse 15 says, "This is a deserted place," this is the disciples speaking, "and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food." And so then we can go to John. Jesus then, on the basis of what had been said by the disciples, lifted up his eyes, looked over the masses, and then turned to Philip with this question as a test. So even though the two versions to some may seem to differ and contradict, they really go hand in hand in completing this conversation for us and what led Jesus to say that to Philip. And then Philip answered in verse 7. He said, 200 denarii worth of bread is not sufficient for them, that every one of them may have a little. So Philip, a man who had witnessed a miracle in Cana in Galilee, where Jesus turned water into wine, a man who had been following Jesus, watching him heal people of diseases that were supposed to be unhealable, uncleansable, he seems to not have anticipated any kind of miracle here. He showed that he had not yet fully learned the lesson of unquestioned trust in Jesus and his divine power. Now, he talks about 200 denarii, and from my research, I learned that 200 denarii is fairly equal to the wages of 200 men. So that's not a small amount of money. That's a fairly significant sum, but we find that it's still not enough to even give a little bit of food to each person there. Verse 8, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There is a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish, but what are they among so many?" So again, this question of what do we do? There's so many people here. How are we possibly going to do this? So amongst the entire crowd, they were only able to find this one person who, some people have said that it's a small boy. The lad translates into someone, a small boy who had 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. When we think of a loaf of bread for us, of course, that's, you go to Walmart, you get a big loaf of bread for sandwiches, but that's not even close to what this would have been. What these would have been is more like a pita-sized bread, like a flat pita bread in a sense. They were probably thin, really flat portions of bread, so even 5 loaves was a really small amount. We also read that the fish were small, more like sardines than catfish or bass or a larger fish that we might imagine in the drawings of the storybooks that we see of this story. So the food provided was barely enough for even just one person. It was more like a snack than anything. But, of course, Jesus had zero doubt about what was going to happen. Jesus said, verse 10, "Make the people sit down." Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down in number about 5,000. In Mark's account, we also see that Jesus had the people sit in ranks, it says, of 50 to 100. So this seems like it's a fairly organized event. It's not just a gathering of large people and then he just has them sit. It seems like he had them a little bit more organized than what we might imagine. So this makes the job, of course, much easier of the disciples when they pass out the food. It helps make sure nobody's missed, making sure the food is easier to serve to the masses. It also helps the people be more comfortable, sitting in a field of grass instead of standing cramped around each other. And this also would have made it much more evident to the people that a miracle was performed as they could see everything happening. If you have 5,000 people standing, maybe 100 of them can see Jesus. But there's multiple things that happen here. He has them sit, and he elevates himself. That way, everyone can see everything happening. He also splits them up. So you can imagine the disciples going down in rows, maybe, giving out food. So everyone can see everything that's going on, making it much more clear of what's actually happening in this scenario. Now, it's mentioned that there were 5,000 men, and this doesn't include the women or the children that might have also been there. And this is in keeping with Jewish custom to number only the men. And it's likely that there were probably comparatively few women and children in view of the distance that many of them would have had to travel. But even in that case, more than 5,000 people were there. That's just what is noted in Scripture. Verse 11, "And Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to the disciples, and the disciples to those sitting down, and likewise of the fish, as much as they wanted. So when they were filled, he said to his disciples, 'Gather up the fragments that remain, so that nothing is lost.' Therefore they gathered them up, and filled 12 baskets with the fragments of the 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had eaten." So we see here that Jesus took the food, and he gave thanks. Matthew and Mark, they say that he blessed the food. And they say, and Luke also noted that, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke noted that he looked up to heaven when he did this. So we learn here that to bless and to offer thanks They mean exactly the same thing. And it's an example of offering thanks at our own tables before a meal, giving a blessing upon the food. So the food was then distributed by the disciples to the crowd as much as they wanted to eat. And of course, we see that plenty was left over. After all of this, 12 baskets were filled with broken pieces and fragments of food. So I think Jesus taught a lesson here in economics, to gather and to save what's left instead of just throwing everything away. Natural resources are an abundant gift, but we shouldn't waste or abuse them in any way. And even though Jesus had the power here to make this overflow of food and in drink that we saw earlier at the wedding, he still had them gather up what was left, save it, that way nothing could go to waste. Verse 14, then those men, when they had seen that sign, the sign that Jesus did, said, "This is truly the prophet who is to come into the world." So, looking at Deuteronomy 18, we know that there was this general expectation that the great prophet, believed also by some Jews to be the Messiah, of course, would come to the earth in this remarkable display of power. And so Jesus' power that led the people to believe that he was just that, of course. And so it should be noted that the miracle was so powerful and so obvious that even the most doubtful of any of the Jews didn't even question it. And the conclusion there was properly drawn that this is the Messiah that you've been reading about. But of course, it's misplaced for a lot of them of thinking it's this earthly king that's coming to reign on the earth and save us. Verse 15, therefore, when Jesus perceived that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he departed again to the mountain by himself alone. So whether or not Jesus himself heard people talking about this plan, or maybe if his disciples heard it and told him, or if he just knew, because we know in John chapter 2, we read about Jesus knowing the hearts of all men. He was fully aware of the disposition of this crowd that wanted to take him and make him king. And so he quickly departed again to be alone. And he knew that such an action, such a big thing would interfere with his work at hand. And so he removed himself from that situation completely. So again, the Jews expected the Messiah to be this earthly king, this earthly ruler, with all the power of other well-known kings, and then to reign in Jerusalem. And of course, Jesus was indeed a king, and is a king, but not in the same way that they thought. He would later set up a kingdom that was spiritual, and its throne would be in heaven, not on earth. Moving on, 16 says, now when the evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into the boat, and went over the sea towards Capernaum, and it was already dark, and Jesus had not come to them. So in John's account here, it only tells us that the disciples went down to the sea, but John doesn't mention any kind of reasoning behind that, and so we have to look at the parallel accounts in Matthew and Mark to actually see the reasoning, and we actually see that Jesus forced them to go. You can probably imagine that from this and everything that's going on, there's probably some reluctance to leaving Jesus by himself amongst this huge crowd of people who wanted to take him and make him king. But Jesus forces them away and says to go and travel. And so there was, they probably didn't want to leave Jesus, and they only left after he had commanded that they do so. From Mark, we learned that Jesus wished to go alone on the mountain to pray. And the boat that they probably traveled on was probably more of like a fishing boat. And even though we can think about how many people were with them, how many people got on this boat, it's probably a fairly large fishing boat, but not so big that they couldn't use oars to paddle it. Verse 18 says, then the sea arose because a great wind was blowing. So when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near the boat, and they were afraid. So we see here that the strong winds stirred the waters, and the waves were getting higher and higher. It was evidently a really sudden storm, which I found wasn't an uncommon thing for that location, that lake and that location. because cold air from the nearby highlands often moved down the valleys and collided with the warm air above the lake. And it produced these severe winds, stormy winds, where shortly before the waters would have been quiet and still. And though they had been on the lake for some time, they'd only covered 3 or 4 miles. And the winds were against them, only pushing them back and keeping them further and further from their destination. And suddenly we find Jesus appears near the boat, walking on the water. Matthew tells us that it was the 4th watch of the night, which would have probably been around 3 in the morning. And when they first see Jesus walking on the water, as if it's solid ground, they give way to terror, not recognizing him, of course, and they thought it was some kind of phantom or ghost drawing near to them in the darkness of this windy and stormy night. But Jesus tells them in verse 20, "It is I, do not be afraid." So quickly Jesus sees that they're afraid, and he calms their fears by identifying himself to them. And even if they couldn't recognize the form approaching them right off the bat, surely they probably recognized Jesus' voice, his calming, soothing voice. He tells them, "It is I, do not be afraid." And Mark, in his account, also adds another part to this and says, "Be of good courage." From this warm and encouraging message, the disciples lost their fear and they rejoiced again to be in the presence of their Savior. Verse 21 says, "Then they willingly received him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land where they were going." Now, though John doesn't mention this in his record, Matthew tells us that Peter, who we know as more of the impulsive of the lot, he asked the Lord for permission to walk upon the water with him. And Jesus grants the request, and so Peter began to walk upon the water, but quickly started to get scared about everything around him and began to sink. And so Jesus grabs him and he rebukes him. And he says, "Oh, you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And then guides him back into the boat. And as soon as Jesus joined them on the boat, we see that the storm ceased and they were immediately transported to the shore of Capernaum, even though they were still probably 3 or 4 miles out from the shoreline. So back to back, looking at what we just read, we see Jesus performing miracles here. And there could be no possible doubt in the disciples' minds at this point about his power after seeing all this. Now, one point of application that I want to call back to as we conclude this section of verses in our study is that before Jesus went down to the disciples in the water, Mark records in Mark 6, verse 48, that Jesus saw them straining and rowing. Now, whether or not Jesus was still up on the mountain where he went to pray, or whether or not he had walked down to the shoreline and was able to be on the shoreline, it would have been, at least for us, nearly impossible to see this small boat 4 or 5 miles away through the horrible, stormy, windy conditions, and as well as the pitch black of the night. You know, imagine standing on a shoreline looking out into a lake at 3 in the morning. There's nothing to be seen, especially if there's a storm. It's an awesome thing to know that no matter what storm might be going on around us, whatever battle we might be facing, we're never out of his sight or beyond the scope of his care. Even when we might be so deep that we forget to look for him, to reach out to him for help, he's already there right by our side. He sees us, and he's walking out on the waters to guide us back to shore. These are the thoughts this evening of the first 21 verses of John as we continue in our study of John.